The immigration clash that continues after Donald Trump's loss at the Supreme Court. Now, the judge in that case is pushing the administration to carry out what is basically the Supreme Court's order to return this man who was mistakenly sent to El Salvador. A point that, as I've told you before, if you've followed the story, is not in dispute. The administration admits that this mistake was made. They admit this was an error, but they haven't yet done anything that we know of publicly to rectify it and have claimed the opposite, that they can't fix it. Now, Donald Trump is basically using this case, which does boil down to one person, to test whether he can defy the high court. Can he drive through the loophole that Chief Justice Roberts left in the way he wrote this order? And will there be consequences? Because the Supreme Court has basically upheld the lower court loss. There are some details there I've mentioned. We'll return to them tonight. But in essence, everyone understands that who's looked at this. The lower court judge ruled against the Trump administration and said that the administration must facilitate this detainee's return from the erroneous location they sent him. Now, there's a new hearing today. That same judge had strong words for Trump's DOJ attorney, saying there'll be no tolerance for gamesmanship or grandstanding here. And so we are in this moment that if you follow these type of things, you say, okay, you remember how it used to be. Even administrations that took large views of presidential power, like Reagan or Bush, would regularly comply with these orders. Indeed, that was an era where we didn't live with the kind of questions we have today. The question today is, what next? If the administration is testing how far it can defy or flout the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court, with several judges appointed by Trump on that, several Supreme Court justices from Trump's term, as well as others, if they can define that, well, what's going to happen day to day at the lower court level? Well, tonight we have some answers on that. And while they might not be all that encouraging for an overnight solution to this problem, it does show you how this is all going to play out. And some of this is, as you've probably heard, uncharted territory. How do you deal with an administration that tests everything and often does so in what many lawyers allege and sometimes evidence shows is dishonest or bad faith? Well, first, the news tonight is this judge is now fast-tracking a probe into whether the DOJ lied and defied in the lead-up to this standoff. Now, you can come to your own conclusions about that. We've covered when the planes took off. You've heard Donald Trump himself and Stephen Miller and others talk openly about what sounds like defying the court. But that is different from how a legal process investigates and then ultimately makes conclusions about something. So whatever one thinks, whether it's likely or not that they were dishonest, now there will be what they call expedited discovery, a fast track of depositions of government officials and others to get to the bottom of this. The judge telling those involved to cancel any vacations and be ready to do this fast. Now, what if people who work for Trump follow his lead and basically try to defy those requests? We've seen this before, especially in the first term. There were people who thought they could get away with what Trump could get away with, and they forgot they weren't president or former president. They weren't as powerful, and they got in a lot of trouble. Some of them went to prison, you may recall. So some of the system does still hold or is supposed to, and there are sanctions available even against current government officials. It could be monetary, could be disciplinary, like their professional status or whether lawyers are allowed to argue in court or keep their bar licenses. It could also potentially eventually lead to jail time, depending on the type of contempt that a judge uses. And this judge is citing exactly those examples today, not saying we're there yet, but weighing possible contempt proceedings against the Trump administration. The judge wants frequent updates on the progress here, and some of those have been lacking. The DOJ continues to echo basically Trump's dodge, putting all this on El Salvador, saying they're only prepared to facilitate Garcia's presence in the U.S. if he shows up, if he presents at a port of entry. This would be, I guess, the hypothetical prison break scenario where Garcia gets out of El Salvadorian's prison and then makes it to a port of the U.S., which is a country where he's having trouble staying. Very unlikely that would happen, even if he somehow got out of the prison. In that case, though, the U.S. would then, the Trump officials say, have him removed to a third country or seek to end what is his current protected status, meaning he's protected from being sent to El Salvador. That was the whole legal issue. They're saying in that case, they would just send him back down there. Now, if that sounds like a bit of legal mumbo jumbo, let's not forget there is a person involved in all this who has a family and a heck of a lot more people and families who will be affected depending on whether they get away with this. With that in mind, again, I've tried to show you the evidence and the facts. I'm showing you what the Trump side says, but let's remember this person and his family. We also want to show you, as part of our reporting, what his wife said today.
find myself pleading with the Trump administration and the Bukele administration to stop playing political games with the life of Kilmer. We will continue standing strong, and we will never give up on you, Kilmer.
That is her view and her plea in what is obviously a difficult situation where, by all accounts, as much we can tell, you have an individual person in the wrong prison, their family suffering and wondering what will happen, and two powerful countries, as she put it, playing games about this person's life. Now, we don't have any evidence that the United States has even requested, say in a phone call or an email, that El Salvador just release Garcia. Wouldn't even have to be at the presidential level of that meeting yesterday, but there's no evidence, as you see here in the filing, that anyone's requested his release. The playbook was blunt at the White House yesterday. El Salvador's president followed Trump's lead, basically playing this game of the catch-22, and we have no power, and we haven't really talked about it, and we can't do it, claiming he couldn't release this individual back to the U.S., who he just got from the U.S. The Attorney General under Trump says they're not going to do it.
What they also said is just facilitate, meaning if he wanted a plane flight, we could give him a plane flight. But we cannot effectuate it, meaning making it happen. President Bukele does not want to give him back to the United States, nor do we want him back.
Right, so that's it.
Now, in fairness to the Attorney General, she is lawyering. She's the top lawyer in the Justice Department, right? She's taking that word that we've now heard so much about since this story broke, facilitate, and giving it her reading, which is the minimum least possible, right? That's their position. And so while it might be a stretch, I showed you the evidence that some people allege there's been bad faith. That itself is under investigation. We are now at the point where this is up to the Supreme Court. If facilitate means do it or try to do it or at least go on record requesting it, well, these are all lawyers. I know some lawyers. I'm a lawyer. You can just deal with that and say, if there were any doubt on the next appeal, because his lawyers can say they have not facilitated it, and that can become another issue on appeal. If he's stuck in the prison, you say facilitate meant try, and at least show on record that you requested and you did not. You are now in breach. You must comply. And we have legal protocols for the passage of individuals between countries, right? This is not a first-time thing. We have extradition for defendants or detainees, even if they might be dangerous or alleged to be so. If they wanted to do this, they could. Now, that case is about one person, as I mentioned, but the precedents will test broader powers in the second Trump era. And everybody knows that. If you follow the news and you're hearing my voice, watching it or hearing it somewhere, you must follow some news. You might recall cases that take many, many months, sometimes over a year, from when the conflict starts to when they reach the Supreme Court. You notice this one got right to the high court, and they unanimously ruled against Trump. Why is that? In this case, the answer is simple. Because everybody gets that these are big, important cases, not because one person will matter in some grand way for years for the national security of the United States, but because these are where the lines will be drawn. And we're seeing the administration try to push past the lines in other detainee cases. Take this Columbia student, Mohsen Madawi, detained by officials in an immigration office in Vermont. Now, his lawyer says he was there actually doing the right thing under law. We hear a lot about how immigrants are supposed to comply, that he showed up there voluntarily, according to the lawyer, and we have evidence of that in the sense that we can see him leaving there. And it was at a site where they were supposed to do a naturalization interview, the final step in pursuing citizenship. But instead, you see him held and walked out, I meant to say, arrested and handcuffed before being removed. The government is not commenting on this yet. We do know that he was part of public pro-Palestinian protests. That's the kind of free speech that every resident of the U.S. can partake in. Citizen or not, by the way, if you're here, you are afforded certain rights, and you have the right to free speech. And recall, it was Trump and his allies like Elon Musk who claimed they were campaigning to protect free speech, be it literally vis-a-vis the government or in a broader sense online. Remember hearing all about that? Well, whatever happens in this case, it's clear there's a lack of respect for free speech that opposes some of their positions. There's also reporting the Trump administration knew in advance that a tough student they detained, Rumaisi Ozturk, in this controversial video taken off the street by ICE agents, she's now in custody in Louisiana. But the Washington Post reports there were no ties to terrorism found, despite the administration claiming the opposite, and it was known, the Post report says, before her arrest. with the determination that, quote, the Trump administration had not produced any evidence showing she engaged in not only anti-Semitic activities, which is related to speech, or like I said, hate speech, or made a public statement supporting a terrorist organization, which could cross over into the kind of legal issues that actually do potentially support removal. The Atlantic says we are seeing, quote, this week, obvious contempt for the Supreme Court and the rule of law. DOJ veteran Andrew Weissman told us last night these immigration cases are showing that the constitutional crisis is here now, he said. Not a close call, not a looming threat, not a what if we get a ruling and they ignore it, but Weissman saying the crisis is here because they have the ruling and they are ignoring it. The only nuance, if you want to give it that, is what I mentioned last night and what we reported the night this case came down. It didn't land as a clear return the guy, right? It landed as facilitate the thing with due deference to the president's powers as commander-in-chief over immigration and foreign policy. So, yes, normal historical administrations comply with this kind of stuff, but you know who we're dealing with here. And so the next move, whether we have a crisis or not, I've shown you different people's views of whether we're at a 7 or a 9 or a 10, is what will the Supreme Court do? Because what I can tell you with all fairness and evidence is this administration ain't facilitating anything as suggested in that ruling.
I'm an alum. There's thousands of alums who have signed petitions saying, Harvard, stand up, follow the rule of law.
Overwhelmingly, us, the students, this is what we want to see from them. And, you know, they're not beholden to what we want, but it's really good to see that they are at least showing signs of resisting.
Hi again, everybody. It's 5 o'clock in New York. So far, the story of Trump 2.0 has largely been a story of obeying in advance and then in confrontation of capitulation. We saw it from law firms who gave in to the administration's demand, tech giants who stood behind Trump for the inauguration, corporations, even Columbia University. But now a striking departure. Harvard University saying it will not cave to orders from the Trump administration's long list of demands that includes removing all DEI programs, including in hiring and admissions, and auditing viewpoints of its student body. Harvard rejected the Trump administration's demands, saying, quote, the university will not surrender its independence or relinquish its constitutional rights. In a scathing letter, Harvard's president, Alan Garber, writes this, quote, the administration's prescription goes beyond the power of the federal government. It violates Harvard's First Amendment rights and exceeds the statutory limits of the government's authority under Title VI. And it threatens our values as a private institution devoted to the pursuit, production, and dissemination of knowledge. No government, regardless of which party is in power, should dictate what private universities can teach, whom they can admit and hire, and which areas of study and inquiry they can pursue. In response, the Trump administration said it will freeze $2.2 billion in grants and $60 million in contracts with the university. This afternoon, Donald Trump threatened to remove Harvard's tax-exempt status, which it has because it is an educational institution. As analysis in the New York Times says, quote, Harvard University is 140 years older than the United States. It has an endowment greater than the GDP of nearly 100 countries and has educated 8 American presidents. So if an institution was going to stand up to the Trump administration's war on academia, Harvard would be at the top of the list. Former federal judge Michael Luttig, who was on this program yesterday, praised the move by the country's oldest and most elite university, telling the New York Times this, quote, this is of momentous significance. This should be the turning point in the president's rampage against American institutions, end quote. Harvard's defiance also drew the attention of someone who doesn't speak out very often these days, former President Barack Obama, a Harvard Law graduate himself, who in 1990 became the first black president of the Harvard Law Review. Former President Obama saying this, quote, Harvard has set an example for other higher ed institutions, rejecting an unlawful and ham-handed attempt to stifle academic freedom while taking concrete steps to make sure all students at Harvard can benefit from an environment of intellectual inquiry, rigorous debate, and mutual respect. Let's hope other institutions follow suit. That is where we start the hour with some of our favorite reporters and friends. New York Times writer at large Elizabeth Bumiller is here. Her byline is on that reporting we just read from. With me at the table, former federal prosecutor, MSNBC legal analyst Christy Greenberg is back. President of Reproductive Freedom for All, Mini Timuraju, is here at the table. And Democratic strategist and professor of practice at Columbia University, MSNBC political analyst Basil Smikle is here. Elizabeth Bumiller, take me through the tale that the Times reports today, that you write today, of Harvard's decision to resist.
Well, Harvard had the administration, the Trump administration, had threatened Harvard earlier with $9 billion in withholding the federal funding, but there was nothing very specific about it. And then this past Friday, Harvard got the letter from the Trump administration outlining basically the way the administration wanted to oversee hiring, curriculum, and other aspects of and coursework, other aspects of life at Harvard, central to the institution. And at that point, Harvard pushed back. That was Monday, with that very, very strong letter. Harvard had been taking some steps on its own to after it was criticized for some of the protests on campus earlier about against Israel. Harvard had not been a peaceful place, but the administration had taken some steps. But this letter was just too far for Harvard, and they pushed back and said, no, thank you. And as a result, of course, Trump responded last night saying that he was going to freeze $2.2 billion in federal funding. Interestingly, he didn't say exactly what federal funds would be affected, but about $7 billion of that $9 billion that was originally threatened, $7 billion of that goes to hospitals, to the Harvard-affiliated hospitals in Boston and Cambridge, including Mass General, Boston Children's, and the Dana-Farber Cancer Center. So they're withholding funding from hospitals that the community uses, potentially.
Unbelievable. When you look at how they'll fight, it's interesting that there are some strange bedfellows here. I want to read from your story, Elizabeth. Quote, Mr. William Burke is also an outside ethics advisor to the Trump Organization and represented the law firm Paul Weiss in the deal it recently reached with the Trump administration. Mr. Robert Hur, who worked in the Justice Department in Mr. Trump's first term, was the special counsel who investigated President Joseph Biden's handling of classified documents and termed him, quote, an elderly man with a poor memory, end quote, enraging Mr. Biden. Both lawyers understand the legal workings of the current administration and an expertise of benefit to Harvard. So Harvard has reached into not just the Republican side, but the Trump side. Tell me about that.
Well, that is what you do if you want people who can argue a good case for you. They know the opposition. Obviously, I got some letters this morning and some emails from readers saying this is a clear conflict of interest in the case of William Burke. But from Harvard's point of view, this is who you want on your side. We'll see what kind of reaction there is from the Trump administration that William Burke is now representing Harvard against the White House. And the same with Robert Hur. He was in the Trump Justice Department in the first term, and certainly he's reviled by many Democrats for his description of the former President Biden. But again, he knows the workings of the Trump Justice Department.
Elizabeth, what are the stakes for Harvard?
They're big. They're huge. I mean, there's Harvard, again, $9 billion in federal funding at stake. Now, Harvard has an extremely large endowment. It's $53 billion. It's the largest in the country. It's larger than the GDP last year of Jordan, plus close to 100 other countries beneath Jordan in GDP. But Harvard, it's a potentially very big fight. We'll see how far the president takes this. He threatened to pull Harvard's tax-exempt status this morning. He doesn't have that power. That is power that is given to Congress, and it would be a very, very tough. They would have to pass a law taking away Harvard's tax-exempt status, and it doesn't seem like it would go anywhere, at least at this point. But he can threaten. He could. There could be a lawsuit. the president and Stephen Miller, one of his most powerful aides, are said to be pleased to have this as a fight. They want to have this fight. They can, if it goes to court and is a protracted fight in court, it could, it would be give them a platform to attack, what they see as the liberalism and elite education run amok.
Elizabeth, let me ask you one more question about Mr. Burke. You write that he was an outside ethics advisor to the Trump org, but that he represented the law firm Paul Weiss. Paul Weiss went in and did a deal. Is that the end game for Harvard, that they go in and do a deal?
I just don't know. It's a very good question. I would think not in this case, but there was a couple of sentences in that letter yesterday saying that they would wanted to talk to the administration. So that I just don't know the answer to that. Right now, it does not look like there's any deal in the offing, given the kind of demands that the White House was making on Harvard.
This has been, Basil, brewing. Here's President Barack Obama at Hamilton College back on April 3rd.
If you are a university, you may have to say, figure out, are we in fact doing things right? Have we in fact violated our own values, our own code, violated the law in some fashion? If not, and you're just being intimidated, well, you should be able to say, well, that's why we got this big endowment. We'll stand up for what we believe in, and then we'll pay our researchers for a while out of that endowment, and we'll give up the extra wing or the fancy gymnasium that we can delay that for a couple of years, because academic freedom might be a little more important.
He's saying it nicely, but I think the point he's trying to make is these are fancy, cushy places for a whole lot of people, and we might have to sacrifice, and not just quote him, quote, a fancy gymnasium or an extra wing, because the very principle of academic freedom might be a little more important.
Yeah, so what Harvard did was extraordinary. And, I know I've been watching this and paying attention to it very closely, because we've been talking about this since 2023, when we were talking about Governor DeSantis and what he was doing with schools in Florida. So this has been, as you said, been brewing for quite some time. I was also concerned about the role of outside influences on university work when they fired Claudine Gay, or pushed her out, if you will. So I was excited to see what Harvard did. Now, I'm at Columbia. My undergraduate alma mater, Cornell, was, said that they were being threatened with $1 billion in a loss of funds. So however you feel about how the universities have responded before Harvard's response, it should be noted that higher education broadly is under attack. And what Harvard did is create this umbrella that hopefully, as the former president has said, that other schools can live under and say, how do we collectively push this back?
And we're going to bring in Courtney Brown, economics reporter for Axios, and Jonathan Hillman, a senior fellow for geoeconomics at the Council on Foreign Relations. Jonathan, I want to start with you. We just heard Steve talk about the ripple effects this is having on everybody, from the guy who's running the port to the lady who runs the coffee shop. We're now hearing the president float the idea of putting new tariffs potentially on things like computer chips and pharmaceutical drugs. What is that going to mean for consumers?
So we saw over the weekend a little bit of relief and some exclusions for some very high tariffs that were placed on Chinese products, especially for smartphones and a range of other electronics. I think that was done because the pain would have been quite severe if those were left on. However, though, U.S. officials have assured us that, don't worry, there are more tariffs coming. And so they've announced just yesterday that they'll be beginning a national security investigation into semiconductors as well as pharmaceuticals. So the timetable on that is a little bit uncertain, but we can expect tariffs to come in both areas.
Courtney, those seem like two very different products for a couple of reasons to me, and you can tell me if I'm an idiot, which I might be. But with things like laptops and electronics and chips, folks can wait on that. They don't have to buy it if they can't afford it. But for things with pharmaceuticals, is it realistic, if there's a production gap, to expect Americans who need a drug that's coming from overseas to not be able to get it for a long period of time, or get it at an exorbitant price?
Right. Exactly how you say. There are some things that can be deferred. There are some things that are more discretionary than other goods. Drugs, not one of them. I think this speaks to the key issue at the heart of President Trump's tariff strategy, which is just you cannot choke off global supply of something so crucial like pharmaceuticals when there is no domestic manufacturing supplier to kind of replace what you're cutting off, because that is in fact what tariffs do. He is seeking to use tariffs as a stick of sorts to convince manufacturers to produce more here in the U.S. But those two things can't happen at the same time. It takes so much time to build a facility and get workers and power it up. So there is going to be this gap. And I think it's a little worrisome to think about how that might affect the pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah. Jonathan, I also want to ask you, because it is tax day, President Trump is now saying money from tariffs could potentially replace income taxes. I want you to listen to the sound we've got.
There is a chance that the money from tariffs could be so great that it would replace, in the old days, about 1870 to 1913, the tariffs were the only form of money. And that's when our nation was relatively the richest. We were the richest.
Can you fact check that for us? Is the president right? Could we see so much revenue from tariffs that income tax could be a thing of the past?
So one of the things that often gets left out when these numbers are tossed around is that as the tariffs rise, the amount of trade declines. And so this is not a one-for-one where we're going to just, it's a little bit different than the IRS.
They're potentially looking at that formula based on the current level of U.S. trade, which the whole goal of this is to lessen that.
That's right. And I'm not holding my breath for this to be a real boon for government spending. And I'm also, frankly, not hoping to go back to 1870, when the U.S. was primarily, an agrarian country, and most homes didn't have electricity.
Yeah. Courtney, I have more stupid questions for you. One of the things that I've been wondering and should probably know the answer to, but don't, is when these tariffs are collected, where does that money go? What agency actually gets it? Who's holding it? How soon do you think we're going to see tariffs start to come in? Is it immediately? Are they already coming in? And how soon does it take to kind of ramp up to make sure all goods, like if it's on the water today, is it getting hit with that tariff? If it was on the water last week, can you kind of walk us through where the money goes?
I think this is the biggest untold story of what's happening with tariffs right now. A story that I'm working on, by the way. So thank you.
Well, give us a little preview. Yeah.
An opportunity to plug it. Customs and Border Protection is known for its role with immigration. But there's also a huge part of that agency that collects tariffs. And guess what? How quickly this trade policy is moving. There are workers at CBP trying to put the infrastructure in place to collect these tariffs. You might remember, it seems like years ago, but it was actually just a few months ago, the Trump administration announced an intention to collect tariffs on goods worth $800 or less. So whatever you're bringing in from Temu or Shein, those goods were going to get tariffs. And then they had to come back and say, just kidding, can't do that yet. We don't exactly have the infrastructure in place to collect the revenue. It seems like they're going to try again to kind of strike what's called the de minimis exemption and put those tariffs in place. But it's taken so much time for CBP to build the capacity to collect those tariffs. So there's kind of like this shadow system of trying to get the money that President Trump says is going to fill government coffers. We don't necessarily have all the things in place to do that yet.
And CBP's got a lot on its plate right now.
Exactly.
Jonathan, I also want to ask you, China's president is on a bit of a charm offensive across Southeast Asia. He urged Vietnam to, quote, oppose unilateral bullying and uphold free trade. The last two administrations, both Democrat and Republican, have been trying to forge closer ties, both militarily and economically, with Vietnam. Do you think Xi is seeing an opportunity here across Asia to maybe bring these folks who had been looking more towards the West back into China's fold?
Definitely. And so Chinese leader Xi Jinping has been not sitting at home waiting for President Trump to call him. He is out there, as you said, on a charm offensive in Vietnam, in Malaysia, and in Cambodia this week. And so they're talking about, opposing bullying and upholding the multilateral trade system. But they're doing more than talking, too. They've signed agreements to deepen cooperation on supply chains. They're pursuing a joint railroad project with Vietnam. And then they're going to look at deepening an agreement that they have with about 10 Southeast Asian countries. And so U.S. tariffs here are effectively rolling out the red carpet for Xi Jinping when he goes into these foreign markets.
Courtney, I also want to ask you about the other word we seem to talk about previously all the time, which is inflation. You've looked at Fed data about consumer concerns as the tariffs take hold. Is there a general worry what this all could do to the already high inflation rate in this country?
In the short term, yes.
Okay.
Consumers are expecting a pretty significant jump in inflation. We saw that in the
And why is that?
Well, they're expecting that companies are going to pass along the extra cost they get from tariffs. They're going to pass along right to the shelves of the things that they buy. Companies have a lot of experience doing that from this inflation shock that we just got through. I mean, I think that was a big shift between the pre-pandemic and the pandemic era. Companies learned how to raise prices. And so I think consumers hear coverage of that and they say, oh, my prices are going to go up, and they maybe rush out and buy things now to avoid potential price increases.
Deja vu all over again. All right. Jonathan Hillman, Courtney Brown, thank you both so much. I think I'm a little smarter now. I really appreciate it.
Gabe, this is a big escalation. Explain where this fight stands now and where we think it goes from here.
Yeah, it is, Chris, and this is a very big escalation. And good afternoon from a very crowded briefing room where this press briefing is set to get started in just a few moments. As you said, after the administration froze those federal fundings yesterday, this morning, President Trump writing on social media an escalation. Perhaps Harvard should lose its tax-exempt status and be taxed as a political entity. This essentially it was what the administration has been arguing, that Harvard University has been pushing a political ideology. But as you mentioned, Chris, Harvard University is not backing down and essentially turning this into a battle over free speech and saying that while some of the administration's demand had to do with combating anti-Semitism, in the university's view, most of them were about stifling free speech. Now, of course, this battle has huge implications, not just for Harvard University, but really for institutions of higher learning across the country. And Chris, it is certainly not the only topic that's going to come up in just a few moments when Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt comes into this briefing room. Certainly there'll be questions about that controversial deportation of the Maryland man who was sent to El Salvador, as well as ongoing questions about the future of the administration's tariff policy, which is, of course, being watched by markets across the world. Chris.
Yeah, without a doubt. Gabe Gutierrez, thank you so much for that. We'll keep our eye where you are. Meantime, Eddie, I want to know just some of what the White House had demanded from Harvard. They want a change in governance, access to hiring and admissions data, an end to all DEI programs, and they want to put multiple departments under external audit. As you well know, other elite universities have faced the same challenge, including where you work, Princeton. So I wonder what your reaction is to Harvard's decision to fight back and the significance of that decision coming from, again, the oldest and richest university in the United States.
I think it's extraordinarily important, Chris, for Harvard to do what it's currently doing. I think it sets the stage for universities and colleges across the country. And remember, these institutions are in some ways a jewel in America's crown, some of the best institutions in the world, for them to defend their basic and basic values, their basic mission. And I think we need to widen the aperture a little bit and ask a different question. What is actually behind this assault? What's behind the attack on America's universities and colleges? It goes back to, in my mind, Chris, to 1951 with William Buckley's book, God and Man at Yale. And he worried about collectivism, Keynesianism, secularism, worried about what liberalism was doing. And that was before Black people and women actually made their way to these institutions. I'm not worried about Christopher Rufo. I'm worried about what the Manhattan Institute, what Reihan Salam is trying to do and attack these institutions. So as Harvard pushes back, we need to ask some deeper questions about what's motivating this assault on free speech and American higher education.
Well, Kimberly, we should note this letter from Harvard did not say that it was suing the Trump administration, but it did come from outside legal counsel. So I wonder what the feeling is, and the people you're talking to say, is the belief that this is headed to court, potentially maybe even the Supreme Court?
I think it is all but certainly headed to the Supreme Court, which will have the opportunity that it, in my opinion, it missed last week in proving to be a guardrail to Donald Trump's autocracy. With all respect to my friend, the professor, I'm going to take it back even further to the 1930s when Nazis marched across Europe. They attacked universities. They attacked the rule of law. They pretended to have the support of the people, all while bending the government to its will to usher in authoritarianism and fascism. And that's the moment that we're in. And the Supreme Court needs to recognize that. Punishing students based on their speech is unconstitutional, regardless of what nation of which they're a citizen. That is just wrong. This should be a layup for the Supreme Court, but so should have been the deportation of a legal resident with no way to get him back. And the Supreme Court let that slide, at least in the preliminary, last week, which means that Kilmar Abrego Garcia still is in that brutal El Salvadoran prison. At some point, the Supreme Court has to stand up, read the Constitution, say enough is enough, and be a check on the president, or else democracy is in peril for all of us, including U.S. citizens.
So, Eddie, former President Obama, who I should note went to two of the universities in question, both Columbia and Harvard, tweeted on Monday that he does believe, as you do, that Harvard is setting an example for other colleges and universities. He said he hopes they do follow suit. Something that we heard from the faculty. We were on campus at Columbia just yesterday, and I want to play that.
Stand up for higher education. Second, fight back against the federal attacks.
We need to ask our leadership, why can't you show the same kind of backbone and principles as the leadership at Harvard and Princeton?
As an educator, what particularly concerns me is this pattern of government overreach that's being tolerated by the powers that be.
If we lose our academic freedom, we have lost everything.
On the other hand, Eddie, the last public accounting, I think it was last year, Harvard had a $53.2 billion endowment. So I'm not saying $2.2 billion isn't anything, but it is comparative, right? And most universities could not take a hit like that. They couldn't even come close to it. So realistically speaking, can other colleges and universities potentially respond the way that Harvard did?
Not necessarily, depending upon their endowments. And we have to understand the hierarchical nature of American higher education. There's a reason why the Ivy Leagues are the Ivy Leagues. There's a reason why the Little Ivies, the Williams, the Swarthmores, the Amhersts, why they are secure, and the other liberal arts colleges are trying to keep, make ends meet. So we need to understand the differential nature of financing, right? The financial status of the institutions in American higher ed. I want to say that up front. But I also want to say that, government investment in higher education has a payoff. It's a public good. Cancer research, healthcare research, research around AI, all of this funding that comes from the federal government that in some ways spurs our work in the STEM areas and in the sciences, as it were, has a benefit. So what does it mean to cut it off in this way? And what will happen? How will it impact the country moving forward in terms of, shall we say, some of the brightest minds across the world making their way here and not feeling comfortable doing their work in a place where autocracy seems to reign? And I think that's a question we have to ask ourselves, Chris, as we move forward.
The other thing, Kimberly, that Eddie said at the start was about, the jewel in the crown and why it's so aspirational. I remember in my small town in Ohio when somebody got into Harvard, it was like the town made a collective gasp, right? That's where these schools stand. And a lot of this money, we should say, is covering students who couldn't otherwise afford to go there, right? 55% of the students at Harvard are receiving some sort of financial aid. A quarter of them come from families that make less than $100,000 a year. Would Democrats be smart to frame this about students? Would they be smart to frame this about what quality is brought in. Because it's a jewel in the crown, foreign students aspire to come here as well, to frame it as a place where research gets done with life-saving programs. How do you fight against this if you are not Harvard, the Harvard president or the Harvard board?
I think absolutely, Chris. That is exactly what Democrats should be saying about this, that this is a brain drain, that this is a gift to our adversaries around the world in terms of our readiness to compete in an economy with the smartest people and the best technology and the most cutting edge research. But I think Democrats should also not shy away from the authoritarianism that is at play here. The reason that the elite institutions are being attacked and not yet some of the other ones is because that is what happens. That is what Trump believes, that the elites are somehow poisoning our nation, and by teaching the truth, by talking about what the Constitution actually says. So they are the target, and unfortunately, some, like my graduate alma mater, Columbia, folded, much to my dismay. But I think as Harvard and MIT and Princeton and others stand up, it will make it easier for Democrats to help defend this, although Democrats shouldn't have needed a reason. They should have been out in front on this from the beginning, and some have, but it needs to be a part of that organized message against what's happening.
Doug, as I'm listening, the word elites has become a four-letter word. The right has become pretty successful, right, at making that seem like it's something terrible. And so I wonder what the goal is here. Is it just political red meat for the base? Or do you think that that would be not very wise, that in fact what this administration wants to do is to fundamentally reshape the relationship between government and universities writ large?
Well, I think it goes beyond the base. And to get to Eddie's first question about what's causing this, I've been stunned at what I've heard just over the past 3 months and even 2 or 3 years of people who are not Donald Trump fans, people who didn't vote for him, might have written in another Republican candidate in primaries or in the general election, who have said, I'm sick and tired of what I'm seeing happen on college campuses. This happened before the attacks in Israel, but certainly as we saw, Palestinian flags being hoisted on college campus after college campus, there's been a very real backlash. This is part of it. I have concerns about how far the president is going on this, and concerns about what research funding is. And I was, Chris, just last week, I was at my alma mater, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I'm on the board of visitors there. And what I saw from my school's leadership was, here's how we're following the law. Here's how we're able to document every bit of spending that we're doing on F&A money, which is so critical in how you're dealing with the federal government. I'd tell universities, you've got your back against the wall and you're a target. This is a time to also think about not just speaking truth to power and all that stuff that makes audiences on MSNBC happy, but how can we do a smarter job given the environment that we're in? And I haven't heard a whole lot of that outside of UNC at this point. And I've spent a lot of time on college campuses, including the Harvard IOP.